Chapter 18. The Ultimatum. The raven arrived with dusk, perching on crystal that should have barred its passage. Evening light filtered through the tower's crystalline walls in shades of amber and dying rose, casting geometric patterns across polished stone floors that had grown too quiet in recent days. Elara's fingers moved through enchantment threads that caught the fading light like captured starfire, weaving protection spells with mechanical precision, while her mind wrestled with isolation that pressed against her shoulders like physical weight. The bird materialized without warning, obsidian feathers gleaming with iridescence that made her eyes water when observed directly. Its presence filled the tower's highest chamber with wrongness that tasted of copper and violated graves, while violet eyes fixed upon her with intelligence that transcended natural behavior. Her hands stilled silver light dissolving into sparks that died against the cooling air. The creature tilted its head with predatory interest, studying her reaction with satisfaction that felt disturbingly human in its calculation. From its beak, parchment unfurled with liquid motion that defied physics. Lord Malthus's seal, pressed into the bottom corner, seemed to drink light from surrounding space, an obsidian sigil that marked the message with authority that transcended normal gameplay mechanics. The very air around the document felt heavier, charged with malevolent purpose that made her skin prickle with recognition. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the parchment, its surface warm against her palms, despite the evening's chill. The texture felt wrong, neither paper nor vellum, but something that pulsed with subtle life beneath her touch. To the oracle whose gifts deserve proper appreciation. The opening words made her skin crawl with horrible familiarity. Possessive language that echoed private conversations meant to remain buried in Ascendancy's premium chambers, phrasing that carried intimate knowledge of her fears and vulnerabilities. 3 souls await judgment in my fortress depths. Offerings to demonstrate the scope of my regard for your independence. Elak the Grateful, whose debt to your protector now serves my purpose. Mira Lightweaver, whose friendship with you has proven most illuminating. Thomas Ironforge, whose recent purchases of rare components reveal such interesting patterns. Each name struck like physical blow, stealing breath from lungs that suddenly felt too small. People who trusted her, supported her, shared honest laughter in moments between commercial transactions. Thomas's weathered hands examining rare crystals with craftsman's appreciation. Mira's bright chatter filling empty spaces with warmth. Elak's grateful nods when she'd helped him understand complex enchantment matrices. Now reduced to pawns in a game whose rules she was only beginning to comprehend. The choice requires no complex calculation. Present yourself at my fortress gates before the third dawn, or witness how deletion claims those who placed faith in your protection. No champions. No rescue attempts. Simply surrender. The final word hung in her vision like condemned man's rope, elegant script that carried weight of inevitability. Her fingers crushed the parchment without conscious thought, feeling it pulse against her palms like trapped heartbeat. The raven's call pierced the evening air, triumph wrapped in mock sympathy that echoed off crystal walls until the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then shadow consumed its form like ink spreading through water, leaving only the acrid scent of burnt copper and violated trust, hanging in air that felt suddenly too thin. Elara sank against the crystal barrier, her legs giving way as strength fled like water through broken stones. The parchment crumpled in fists that shook with more than fear, the warm pulse of its unnatural material still pressing against her palms. Through the transparent wall, Blackridge's lights twinkled like distant stars, a community she'd sworn to protect now empty, because association with her had become death sentence. Wind rattled the tower's crystalline framework, sending harmonics through the structure that sounded like warning bells. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf's howl echoed long and mournful, as if the very landscape grieved for what was lost. Footsteps on the spiral stairs brought familiar relief despite circumstances that made comfort feel like luxury she couldn't afford. The measured rhythm of Vance's approach carried through stone and crystal, each step speaking of controlled fury mixed with protective determination. Even before he appeared, she could sense his presence rising toward her like flame climbing toward oxygen. The leather of his boots whispered against stone steps worn smooth by years of honest use. Metal fittings on his armor clinked softly with each movement, creating melody that had become more comforting than any symphony. The scent of him preceded his physical form, honest steel and leatherwork, mixed with something indefinably warm that belonged uniquely to the man beneath the warrior's trappings. When he emerged onto the observation level, his presence filled spaces that emptiness had made too large. Equilibrium's weight shifted across his back as he took in her posture. The crumpled parchment, the lingering wrongness that clung to the air like smoke.
Message?
He asked, though her posture already provided answers he didn't want to hear. She handed him the ultimatum without words, watching his weathered features harden as he read. His jaw tightened with each line, tactical mind processing implications that went beyond simple threat into territory of systematic psychological warfare. The parchment seemed to pulse faster in his grip, as if feeding on his growing anger.
3 days?
He said finally, voice rough with controlled fury.
3 people.
Her voice cracked despite efforts to maintain composure, the words emerging smaller than whispers.
3 friends who made the mistake of trusting me.
Vance moved closer, his approach stirring the air with warmth that carried hints of wood smoke and honest work. When his hand found her shoulder, the contact sent familiar electricity through silk that felt inadequate against evening's chill. His palm was warm against her skin, calloused fingers that spoke of real effort rather than manufactured perfection.
Not your fault.
Isn't it?
She pulled away from comfort that felt like indulgence when others faced deletion, the loss of his touch leaving cold spaces that seemed to echo with absence.
Every person who's helped me, every friendship I've accepted, all of it makes them targets for someone who knows exactly where to strike.
The crystal walls reflected their separation like fractured mirror, showing 2 figures isolated by circumstances that turn connection into weapon. Outside, the first stars appeared in darkening sky, their light seeming distant and cold compared to the warmth she'd just abandoned.
Then we get them back.
The simple certainty in his voice carried echoes of their synchronized abilities, tactical assessment that found solutions where others saw only systematic destruction. But mathematics didn't lie, and the enemy's advantages appeared insurmountable as mountain ranges.
With what army? What resources?
Her gesture encompassed the tower's emptiness, crystalline walls that reflected solitude, where bustling commerce once created warmth and purpose.
He has hostages, superior forces, intimate knowledge of everything we've built together. Every move we might make, he's already planned countermeasures.
Understanding passed between them like current through water. Recognition that Lord Malthus possessed intelligence that transcended normal observation, someone feeding him information with precision, that spoke of systematic betrayal at levels they'd never suspected. The wind grew stronger, rattling crystal panels with increasing urgency. Somewhere in the darkness beyond Blackridge's walls, forces were moving. Preparing. waiting for the inevitable surrender that mathematics demanded. Maps and documents spread across crystal surfaces as evening deepened into night, their edges weighted down with enchanted stones that glowed with soft blue radiance. Vance studied the Ultimatum's language patterns with Death Runner precision, his finger tracing specific phrases while his mind cataloged turns of speech that triggered recognition like fragments of half-remembered nightmares. The systematic escalation, the illusion of choice masking, inevitable consumption, predatory tactics he'd witnessed in servers where death carried permanent consequences that followed players into their physical lives.
Professional work?
He said, pointing to passages that made the parchment pulse faster beneath his touch.
Not random cruelty or opportunistic targeting. This is calculated psychological pressure designed to exploit specific vulnerabilities.
Elara traced one finger along the parchment's edge, feeling it warm further under her touch. The wrongness of the material made her skin crawl, but she forced herself to study the elegant script that carried such poison.
He knows exactly how to hurt me most efficiently.
Targeting protective instincts. Using compassion as weapon of control.
Vance's voice carried analytical coolness that masked whatever emotions drove the tension visible in his shoulders.
Someone's taught him your patterns with mathematical precision.
The implication hung between them like blade waiting to fall. Lord Malthus possessed knowledge that suggested systematic observation, detailed understanding of psychological profiles that went beyond casual gaming interaction into territory of professional stalking. Around them, the tower's magical defenses hummed with increased activity, responding to violation they couldn't fully comprehend. The air itself felt different, charged with recognition of enemy whose capabilities transcended normal countermeasures.
The language?
She whispered, recognition crystallizing with horrible clarity that made her stomach clench.
It's familiar in ways that go beyond simple observation.
How familiar?
His gray eyes met hers across the scattered intelligence, storm clouds gathering in depths that had learned to hide deeper emotions behind tactical assessment. Her hesitation spoke volumes, professional discretion warring with tactical necessity, while secrets pressed against her throat like stones. The information felt too dangerous for acknowledgement, even when circumstances demanded truth that could save lives.
Other contracts.
She said finally, the admission tasting bitter as old copper.
The rich boys all want the same thing. Surrender in mind and soul.
Vance nodded with understanding that asked no questions while offering complete support. His expression shifted to something gentler, recognition without judgment, that made her chest tight with emotions she couldn't afford to examine. The crystal walls seemed to press inward as understanding multiplied like virus through system architecture. Not random targeting, but systematic campaign designed by someone with intimate access to her professional obligations and personal vulnerabilities. Wind outside grew stronger, rattling the tower's framework with increasing urgency. The sound created harmonics through the crystalline structure, notes that spoke of approaching storm and forces gathering in darkness beyond their sight.
How long?
Vance asked, his voice carrying careful neutrality that invited truth without demanding it.
Months. Maybe longer.
Her voice carried weight of dawning comprehension that made her hands shake against the crystal surface.
Every conversation, every preference, every reaction, cataloged and analyzed. All of it feeding into comprehensive understanding of exactly how to break my resistance most efficiently.
The tactical implications were staggering. an enemy who possessed not just current intelligence, but historical psychological profiles. Someone who'd been building dossiers across virtual environments with patience that spoke of obsession rather than simple professional interest.
Then, we changed the mathematics.
Vance said simply, his certainty carrying echoes of sacrifice mechanics that turned personal loss into tactical advantage.
How?
Her gesture encompassed their situation with helpless fury that made her voice crack.
Every advantage belongs to him. And he's been building those advantages for months while we remained unaware.
Not every advantage.
His certainty carried weight that made her look up from maps and documents that offered no solutions. In his eyes, she saw calculation that went beyond normal tactical assessment into territory that made her breath catch with recognition of what such strategy would require.
What do you mean?
He expects submission or defiance. Binary choice designed to mask alternatives and channel responses into predetermined patterns.
Vance's finger traced the ultimatum's elegant script, the parchment pulsing faster under his touch.
But there's always a third option in systems this complex.
Which is,
We give him exactly what he wants.
His eyes met hers across the scattered intelligence, gray depths carrying tactical assessment that found opportunity in systematic disadvantage.
And make him regret every moment of getting it.
The words carried Death Runner certainty, mathematical precision applied to scenarios, but as understanding dawned, her breath caught with recognition of what such strategy would demand. Not just her submission to protect the hostages, but his willingness to let her walk into enemy hands, while trusting that sacrifice would create opportunities for counterattack that their foe wouldn't anticipate. Outside, something howled in the darkness. Not wolves this time, but something that made the tower's crystal walls ring with harmonic resonance that spoke of unnatural forces moving through night that had grown too quiet. The hunt was entering its final phase, and every choice led toward the same inevitable conclusion. Night settled over Blackridge like funeral shroud, woven from shadow and abandoned hope. Elara stood at the tower's highest window, and her palms pressed against crystal that felt cold despite the magical energies flowing through its structure. Below, empty streets reflected starlight that seemed distant and uncaring, while wind carried scents of approaching winter and fears too large to contain. The settlement that had once bustled with life now lay hollow as discarded shell, its remaining population huddled behind walls that offered physical protection, but could do nothing against the psychological warfare that turned community into liability. Behind her, she could hear Vance moving through the chamber with careful precision, boots whispering against crystal floors, while he studied maps and intelligence that offered no genuine solutions. His presence provided warmth that made the emptiness seem less absolute, but even the steady rhythm of his breathing couldn't chase away mathematics that offered no path toward victory.
the hostages.
She said quietly, her breath fogging the crystal surface.
They trusted me to keep them safe through simple commerce.
They chose to help.
His voice carried gentle correction that tried to lift weight from shoulders that felt crushed beneath responsibility.
Different mathematics than simple cause and effect.
Is it?
She pressed her forehead against the cold crystal, feeling its structure resonate with magical energies that seemed inadequate against forces arrayed beyond its protection.
When my very presence made them targets for someone who's been cataloging my relationships for months.
She felt rather than saw his approach, footsteps silent on floors that hummed with defensive energy. The leather of his armor creaked softly as he moved, familiar sounds that spoke of countless battles fought together. When his hands settled on her shoulders, the contact sent electricity through fabric that felt inadequate against night's chill. His palms were warm against her skin, calloused fingers that carried strength without harshness. The scent of him filled her awareness. Honest steel and leatherwork mixed with something indefinably warm that belonged to the man beneath the warrior's exterior.
Not your responsibility alone.
He murmured against her hair, breath-stirring silver strands that caught starlight through the crystal barriers.
Then whose?
She leaned back against his chest, feeling a heartbeat that hammered with controlled fury through leather and steel. The solid weight of him provided anchor against currents that threatened to sweep away everything she valued.
Every choice I've made, every relationship I've allowed, all of it becomes weapons he can wield with surgical precision.
His arms circled her waist with protective intensity, creating sanctuary that felt increasingly fragile against forces arrayed beyond the crystal walls. The steady rise and fall of his chest against her back provided rhythm that helped slow her racing pulse.
Including this,
She whispered, the admission tasting of fear and growing desperation.
This?
His voice carried careful neutrality, but she could feel tension building in the muscles of his arms.
us to
The word carried weight that made her chest tight with emotions she couldn't afford to examine.
what we've built together. The synchronization, the trust, the connection that goes beyond simple partnership.
She gestured helplessly at the space between them that felt charged with possibility and threat in equal measure. Their magical bond, forged through ritual and acknowledged in moonlit sanctuary, had created something unprecedented in her experience. But unprecedented also meant vulnerable to exploitation by enemies who understood the mathematics of emotional leverage. Understanding settled like physical weight between them, heavy as stone and twice as cold. Their connection had revealed compatibility that felt dangerously close to destiny, but destiny could be perverted into chains that bound them to destruction rather than liberation.
He'll use it.
She continued, her voice barely audible above the wind that rattled crystal panels with increasing urgency.
Use you to control me, or me to hurt you. The ritual proved we're synchronized, and synchronization creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited.
Vance's silence carried recognition that made her heart ache with loss that hadn't yet occurred. Their magical connection had become more than professional partnership, more than simple attraction. It felt like recognition of something that belonged to both of them while transcending either individually. But recognition also meant visibility to enemies who turned strength into weakness with mathematical precision.
Maybe.
He said finally, words emerging with careful consideration.
But some things justify their cost, regardless of strategic calculation.
Do they?
She pulled away from embrace that felt like indulgence when others faced permanent consequences, the loss of his warmth, leaving cold spaces that echoed with absence.
When the cost includes your deletion. Micah's welfare? Everyone who's ever shown me kindness, becoming targets for systematic elimination.
Professional distance reasserted itself like armor against intimacy that created additional vulnerabilities for enemy exploitation. The space between them felt suddenly vast, charged with electricity that carried pain rather than pleasure.
Elara.
His voice held something that sounded like breaking, but she couldn't afford to hear it.
Don't.
Her words carried desperate finality that surprised them both.
Whatever this is between us, whatever we've built through shared trials and acknowledged connection, it becomes weapon in his hands. The deeper our bond, the more efficiently he can destroy us both.
The crystal walls reflected their separation like fractured mirror, showing two people who'd discovered perfect partnership only to recognize it as fatal weakness. Around them, Blackridge's defenses hummed with protective energy that felt increasingly inadequate against enemy, who turned love itself into an instrument of control. Outside, violet eyes watched from distant towers, and something that had once been human smiled with predatory satisfaction. The hunt had achieved its primary objective. His precious prey finally understood that every strength could become weakness. Every connection transformed into chain that bound her to inevitable possession.
So what's the solution?
Vance asked quietly, his voice carrying weight of tactical assessment, applied to scenarios that offered no genuine victory conditions.
I don't know.
The admission tasted bitter as defeat, metallic flavor that filled her mouth with recognition of systematic failure.
But I won't let our connection become the weapon that destroys everyone we care about.
Wind grew stronger outside, carrying sense of approaching storm and forces moving through darkness that had grown too quiet. Somewhere in the distance, something howled with triumph that spoke of traps closing in prey, finally understanding the inevitability of capture. 3 days remained, and with each passing hour, the mathematics became more certain. Surrender was not just inevitable. It was the only rational choice that offered any hope of minimizing the damage their enemy could inflict on those who'd made the mistake of caring about them. The walls were closing from every direction, and for the first time since arriving in Covenant, Elara began to understand why some players chose deletion over continued existence in worlds that had grown too small to contain their fears. Chapter 19, The Noose Titans. The contract termination notice glowed with clinical precision on Elara's work tablet. Harsh blue light cutting through the pod's dim interior like surgical instrument through flesh. Morning light filtered through their residential unit's single porthole, a circular window no larger than dinner plate, that offered the only natural illumination in their cramped quarters. The weak rays caught dust motes floating through recycled air that tasted metallic and stale, while official documents spread across their fold-out table like evidence of systematic execution. Each accusation had been crafted with bureaucratic artistry, designed to appear legitimate while destroying everything she'd built over months of careful professional cultivation. The tablet's surface felt warm against her trembling fingers, its haptic feedback responding to her touch with tiny vibrations that seemed to mock the magnitude of destruction contained within.
Performance inconsistencies resulting in client dissatisfaction?
She read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper that seemed to echo in the pod's confining walls.
Failure to maintain contracted engagement standards. Breach of professional conduct protocols.
Each line cut deeper than simple credits lost. Without Julian's premium environments, reality withdrawal syndrome clawed at her consciousness with increasing intensity, phantom sensations that made her skin feel like it belonged to someone else. Virtual tastes of impossible feasts mocked her tongue, while basic sustainment paste sat untouched on the narrow shelf. Beside their compact cooler, its beige uniformity offensive after months of manufactured perfection. Her hands shook with withdrawal symptoms that went beyond simple disappointment. The real world felt flat and insufficient, colors washed out like watercolors left in rain. Even the pod's familiar surfaces seemed alien, textures inadequate, compared to premium simulation that had rewired her neural pathways to expect more than reality could provide. The metallic walls pressed inward with claustrophobic persistence, their industrial functionality a harsh contrast to the crystalline elegance of virtual palaces she could no longer afford to access. Overhead lighting buzzed with electronic hum that irritated nerves, sensitized by months of perfect audio design. Micah's voice carried from the pod's compact hygiene unit, concern filtering through recycled air, that carried hints of cleaning solutions and mechanical processes. The sound of running water created hollow echoes in the small space.
Everything okay out there?
Fine.
She lied, fingers trembling against the tablet's smooth surface that felt cold despite its electronic warmth.
Just reviewing some contract modifications.
The half-truth tasted bitter as copper coins, metallic flavor that filled her mouth with recognition of systematic failure. How could she explain that their world was crumbling? Because she'd finally found courage to refuse demands that violated every boundary she'd tried to maintain. That Julian's systematic destruction reached into every corner of their existence, with bureaucratic precision that made resistance seem impossible. Steam escaped from the hygiene unit as Micah completed his morning routine, carrying scents of standard-issue soap and recycled water that had been filtered through industrial systems. The familiar sounds of daily preparation provided counterpoint to the silence that pressed against her consciousness like physical weight. Her tablet chimed with another notification, the sound sharp and intrusive in their small space. Housing reassignment review. Educational funding questions. Supply chain disruptions affecting her specific preferences. Each message arrived with mathematical timing that spoke to coordination rather than coincidence. Nausea rolled through her stomach in waves that made the pod's walls seem to pulse with mechanical rhythm. Disorientation that turned familiar surfaces into alien territory, withdrawal symptoms that went beyond simple discomfort into physiological rebellion against reality that felt inadequate after artificial perfection. Micah emerged from the hygiene unit, his movements carefully casual as he gathered educational materials into neat stacks. At 16, he possessed enough perception to recognize crisis while maintaining enough wisdom to avoid probing wounds that weren't ready for examination. His dark hair was still damp from washing, and he moved with quiet efficiency through their cramped quarters. The scent of him was familiar and comforting, soap in youth and something indefinably warm that belonged to the brother who'd never asked questions about work that provided their survival. He navigated their pod's limited space with practiced ease, avoiding obstacles that could catch unwary movement.
School supplements got approved for another semester.
He said, the news carrying forced brightness that couldn't quite mask underlying concern. His voice had grown deeper over recent months, reminding her that time passed even when circumstances made each day feel like eternal struggle.
Coordinator said the funding review went smoothly.
Elara's stomach clenched with new dread that added layers to withdrawal symptoms, already making concentration difficult. If Julian's influence extended into educational bureaucracy, then even Micah's intellectual development could become weapon-wielded against her resistance. The tablet's surface grew warmer under her grip, haptic feedback responding to her emotional state with subtle vibrations that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her accelerated heartbeat. Around them, the pod's environmental systems hummed with electronic persistence that spoke of machinery working to maintain livable conditions in space too small for natural comfort.
That's wonderful.
She managed, filing the information as another thread in the web that was tightening around their lives with mathematical precision. The notification chime announced another official communication, its electronic tone cutting through recycled air that tasted increasingly stale. Their pod rental scheduled for routine reassignment review. Standard procedure that happened to coincide perfectly with her contract termination, creating systematic pressure that felt random while following predictable patterns. Overhead lighting flickered briefly, reminding her that even basic utilities depended on systems controlled by others. Everything from air circulation to waste processing required credits and approvals that could be manipulated by those with sufficient resources and motivation.
I might be working different contracts for a while,
She said, needing to plant seeds of explanation without revealing the scope of their vulnerability.
Income might fluctuate until I can establish new professional relationships.
Micah's nod carried mature understanding that made her chest tight, with emotions she couldn't afford to examine. He'd learned to read economic anxiety in their cramped quarters, recognizing the signs of financial instability, despite her efforts to shield him from adult concerns that felt increasingly impossible to contain.
Whatever you need to do,
He said simply, his voice carrying quiet faith that nearly broke her remaining composure.
we'll figure it out. We always do.
The confidence in his tone made her want to weep with grief for innocence that couldn't survive much longer under systematic pressure, designed to force choices no one should have to make. He trusted her to navigate crises that felt increasingly impossible to solve, believing in solutions she wasn't certain existed. As he gathered his materials and prepared to leave for his educational pod, Elara remained surrounded by documents that painted mathematical certainty of their destruction. Julian's retaliation had arrived through channels that offered no appeal, each accusation technically accurate while serving systematic revenge. But the worst part wasn't the financial pressure or even the withdrawal symptoms that made reality feel inadequate. It was the recognition that this represented only the beginning of what someone with Julian's resources could accomplish when love transformed into obsession, when rejection triggered retaliation designed to force eventual submission through systematic strangulation of every alternative. The housing office's clinical efficiency felt different now, sterile authority that masked systematic harassment beneath bureaucratic procedure designed to appear impartial while serving shareholder interests. Fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across utilitarian furniture that spoke of institutional indifference to individual hardship. The air conditioning hummed with mechanical persistence, circulating recycled atmosphere that carried hints of cleaning solutions and administrative efficiency. Every surface gleamed with antiseptic cleanliness that felt cold and unwelcoming.
Routine reassignment review.
The official explained, her voice carrying professional detachment that made individual suffering seem irrelevant to systematic processes. Her fingers moved across holographic displays with practiced efficiency, calling up files that reduced human lives to data points and credit ratings.
Standard protocol for residential pods experiencing tenant status changes.
The woman's appearance suggested middle management efficiency, hair pulled back in regulation style while her uniform carried insignia that spoke of authority without real power. Her desk displayed no personal items, nothing that suggested individual personality beneath institutional function. Elara processed the carefully neutral language, recognizing how Julian's influence operated through systems designed to appear impartial while serving those with sufficient resources to shape outcomes. Her contract termination had triggered automatic review of housing eligibility, creating pressure that felt random while following perfectly predictable patterns.
Timeline for completion?
she asked, her voice steady despite withdrawal symptoms that made concentration difficult.
14 standard days.
The official's smile held apologetic regret that felt rehearsed rather than authentic.
Unless complications arise during the evaluation process.
The subtle threat carried weight of bureaucratic inevitability. Complications would arise because someone with Julian's resources could ensure they did. Reviews would extend indefinitely while alternative housing proved mysteriously unavailable, forcing choices between impossible options. From the housing office, she navigated corridors that felt narrower than memory suggested, walls pressing inward with institutional oppression that spoke of systems designed to contain rather than comfort. The recycled air tasted increasingly stale, while overhead lighting flickered with electronic inconsistency that reminded her how dependent their existence had become on approvals and credits controlled by others. At the education center where Micah received supplemental instruction, the coordinator's smile held apologetic concern that felt theatrical rather than genuine. His workspace displayed holographic files that shifted and rearranged as he spoke, creating visual representation of bureaucratic complexity designed to obscure rather than illuminate.
Funding review came back with some questions.
He explained, spreading documents across his workstation with theatrical reluctance that suggested rehearsed performance.
Nothing serious, but the approval might face delays, while additional documentation is processed through appropriate channels.
More pressure applied with surgical precision, each official explaining problems that weren't quite problems, while creating obstacles that weren't quite insurmountable. Julian's systematic approach targeted every aspect of their stability, creating multiple crisis points that demanded simultaneous attention while offering no realistic solutions.
How long for documentation review?
She asked, though the pattern was becoming predictable as mechanical processes.
Could be several weeks. Possibly longer if additional verification becomes necessary.
His shrug carried bureaucratic helplessness that masked institutional indifference to individual consequences. The pattern was undeniable. Now systematic destruction orchestrated through official channels that maintained plausible deniability while serving personal vendetta. Julian's obsession had evolved into a campaign of economic warfare, designed to force submission through financial strangulation that would appear natural rather than manufactured. Even the black market corners where she occasionally acquired flavor enhancers had gone cold, vendors absent or claiming ignorance of previous arrangements. Standard products had become mysteriously unavailable, forcing reliance on basic sustainment that tasted increasingly like cardboard against her withdrawal-sensitized palate.
Supply chain disruptions.
One new dealer explained with shrug that suggested problems beyond his control.
Happens sometimes with luxury items when demand fluctuates.
But luxury items for everyone else remained plentiful, their availability consistent with normal market function. Only her specific preferences had become scarce, creating isolation that extended into the smallest details of daily survival. By evening, the scope of Julian's reach had become undeniable. Housing threatened through official channels, education funding questioned by appropriate authorities, even minor comforts systematically eliminated through market manipulation that appeared natural while serving personal obsession. In their cramped pod, surrounded by walls that seemed to press inward with increasing pressure, Elara stared at documents that painted mathematical progression towards surrender. Julian had calculated every avenue of resistance, blocked every escape route, created circumstances where submission would seem like rational choice, rather than coerced capitulation. The AI systems that governed their existence seemed blind to the manipulation, or perhaps willfully ignorant of shareholder prerogatives that transcended individual welfare. Official complaints would disappear into bureaucratic processing that served those with sufficient resources to shape outcomes through legal channels that offered no genuine recourse. But Covenant still waited. Virtual sanctuary where she possessed resources Julian might not have calculated into his systematic campaign. In that digital realm, different rules applied and different possibilities existed for resistance that couldn't be eliminated through bureaucratic manipulation. Lord Malthus approached Blackridge's gates under a flag of parley that transformed familiar defensive structures into stage for psychological warfare designed to break rather than bargain. The necromancer's presence tainted the air itself, unnatural cold that made even NPC guards recoil from hunger that radiated from his obsidian armor like waves of malevolent energy. Violet electricity crackled around his form with irregular patterns that hurt to observe directly, while crystalline cages floated behind him like grotesque trophies displaying captured players trapped between life and deletion. Elara watched from Blackridge's ramparts, stone battlements that had once felt like sanctuary, now serving as observation post for approaching nightmare. The familiar weight of carved granite beneath her hands provided anchor against growing dread that threatened to overwhelm rational thought. From her elevated position, she could see the systematic precision of Malthus's approach. Each step carried theatrical authority, while violet eyes surveyed defensive positions with intelligence that transcended normal NPC's behavior. His movements spoke to personality she'd learned to read during months of premium performance, recognizing Julian's distinctive mannerisms beneath necromantic grandeur. The way he held his shoulders with calculated confidence, the precise spacing of his steps that suggested choreographed entrance, even the timing of his arrival during Blackridge's most vulnerable hour. All of it spoke to understanding that went beyond tactical observation into territory of intimate knowledge, weaponized for psychological effect. Wind carried scents of approaching storm across the ramparts, mixing with unnatural coldness that seemed to emanate from Malthus's presence like corruption made manifest. The familiar sounds of Blackridge's daily life had grown quiet, residents withdrawing behind walls that offered physical protection, but could do nothing against systematic pressure designed to break morale.
Vance,
She whispered, not turning from her observation of the approaching threat. His presence materialized beside her without sound, familiar warmth that steadied her pulse, despite circumstances that should have made comfort impossible. The leather of his armor creaked softly as he moved, while equilibrium's weight shifted across his back, with metallic whispers that spoke of readiness for violence. The scent of him reached her first, honest steel and leather work that belonged to someone who'd earned his strength through actual effort. Then the familiar sound of controlled breathing that never betrayed inner turmoil, despite tactical situations that would break lesser resolve. His presence filled space beside her with warmth that pushed back against unnatural cold radiating from their enemy.
Count?
He asked, following her gaze toward the floating cages that bobbed like nightmare balloons in air that shimmered with malevolent energy.
3 confirmed. Alakmira, Thomas.
Each name carried weight of friendship, betrayed by association with her, people who trusted her protection only to become leverage in psychological warfare that turned compassion into weapon.
Alive but unable to log out. Trapped between states in magical suspension that could last indefinitely.
Through the crystalline barriers of their imprisonment, She could see familiar faces pressed against transparent walls. Elak's weathered features twisted with frustration as he pounded silent fists against magical containment. Mira's bright spirit dimmed to desperate fear as she recognized the scope of her captivity. Thomas's craftsman hands searched for weakness in crystalline structure that offered no escape. Vance's hand found the small of her back, contact that sent familiar electricity racing through her despite the weight of impossible choices pressing against her consciousness. His palm was warm against silk that felt inadequate protection against elements both natural and supernatural. His touch spoke of partnership that transcended tactical cooperation, connection that had grown through trials into something worth protecting, despite the vulnerability it created.
Terms?
He asked, voice carrying Deathrunner precision that sought tactical understanding of enemy demands.
Unchanged from the original Ultimatum.
Her words emerged hollow with recognition of systematic defeat.
Surrender willingly or watch everything crumble piece by piece.
Below them, Malthus reached speaking distance of Blackridge's massive gates. His voice carried across the courtyard with possessive undertones that made her skin crawl despite the virtual nature of their interaction. Even his physical positioning spoke to personality she recognized, calculated distance, that suggested confidence in inevitable victory, while maintaining theatrical authority designed for maximum psychological impact.
My radiant oracle.
He called violet energy, crackling around his form like hungry lightning, seeking targets for consumption.
Have you considered my generous offer with the attention it deserves?
The possessive terminology echoed Julian's ascendancy sessions with uncomfortable accuracy that made her stomach clench with recognition. Not just similar language patterns, but identical inflection and timing that spoke to shared origin beneath different virtual facades. Wind gusted across the ramparts, carrying his voice upward, while sending her silver hair streaming behind her like banner of defiance that felt increasingly hollow. The stone beneath her hands had grown cold with approaching winter and unnatural influences that seemed to drain warmth from everything they touched.
Your friends grow restless in their accommodations?
Malthus continued, gesture indicating the crystalline cages where familiar figures pressed against transparent barriers.
Deletion would be merciful, compared to extended suspension between states of existence.
Elara's chest tightened as she recognized the mathematical precision of his psychological warfare. Julian had chosen hostages whose safety would matter most to her, creating leverage that traditional heroism couldn't counter through simple violence or tactical superiority. The trapped players moved within their crystalline prisons, like insects preserved in amber, their struggles visible but helpless against magical containment that offered no weakness to exploit. She could see their mouths moving in silent pleas that reached her through crystalline barriers, desperation that made her want to leap from the ramparts despite the futility such gesture would represent.
What assurance do we have of their safety if I comply?
She called down, her voice carrying across the courtyard with hollow authority.
My word as nobleman of the realm.
His smile held predatory satisfaction that spoke to confidence in inevitable victory.
Serve willingly. And they return to whatever mundane existence you deem valuable. Refuse.
He shrugged with elegant malice that made violet energy pulse, brighter around his armored form.
Accidents happen in unstable, magical containment.
Vance's arm circled her waist with protective intensity, creating anchor point against systematic pressure that threatened to overwhelm rational thought. His solid presence provided warmth that pushed back against despair, But even his steady breathing couldn't change mathematics that offered no genuine solutions to problems that transcended normal tactical considerations. Around them, Blackridge's defenders maintained positions along the ramparts, but their presence felt inadequate against enemy whose capabilities transcended normal military engagement. This wasn't battle that could be won through superior tactics or individual heroism.
How long to decide?
She asked, though the answer was becoming predictable as countdown toward inevitable submission.
Dawn approaches quickly, my dear Oracle.
Violet eyes fixed on her position, atop the ramparts with hunger that made her skin crawl.
3 days remain before patience transforms into action that serves efficiency over mercy.
The threat carried weight that transcended virtual consequences. Julian's real-world systematic pressure would continue regardless of her covenant decisions, but submission here might provide him with psychological victory that justified escalation in their other interactions. As Malthus withdrew with theatrical flourish, his crystalline cages floating behind him like promise of inevitable possession, Elara recognized the scope of systematic defeat that approached from multiple directions. In Covenant, he held hostages she couldn't abandon without violating every principle that made existence meaningful. In reality, he controlled resources she couldn't survive without. The mathematics were undeniable and absolute.
Different equations possible?
Vance said quietly, his voice carrying Deathrunner's certainty that found opportunity where others saw only systematic disadvantage.
Such as?
Her question emerged with desperate hope that felt dangerous to acknowledge.
Give him what he wants.
His words carried echoes of their earlier conversations, tactical assessment that suggested alternatives to binary choice between submission and defiance.
Make him regret every moment of getting it.
Above them, storm clouds gathered with unnatural speed, while Violet eyes watched from obsidian towers that grew larger each day. The systematic pressure was working with mathematical precision, creating circumstances where surrender would seem like rational choice rather than coerced capitulation. 3 days remained, and with each hour the certainty of defeat became more undeniable than the stone beneath their feet.